It was Christmas Day 1642, though by the calendar England would later adopt, the year was technically 1643. In a small stone manor house in the village of Woolsthorpe, in the county of Lincolnshire, a child came into the world so small and so frail that no one who witnessed the birth believed he would survive the night. His mother, Hannah Ascough Newton, had been widowed 3 months earlier, before she even had the chance to introduce her husband to the child he would never meet. Isaac Newton Sr., farmer, landowner, a man who could not read or write his own name, had died of a fever in October, leaving behind a modest estate, a grieving young wife, and an unborn son who would one day change the nature of human understanding. The infant was, by all contemporary accounts, impossibly small. Years later, Newton himself would recall that he had been born tiny enough to fit inside a quart pot. 2 women who went to fetch medicines from the village were so certain of his imminent death that they took their time returning, convinced there was no rush. They found him still breathing when they came back, and were reportedly surprised. The village of Woolsthorpe was nothing remarkable. A scattering of farmhouses and fields set against the flat, wind-scoured landscape of the English Midlands, where the sky felt enormous and human lives felt very small. It was the kind of place where people were born and died within a few miles of each other, where the rhythms of planting and harvest dictated the shape of existence, and where a boy who stared too long at the sky might be considered odd. Hannah nursed her fragile son through that first winter with a kind of fierce, sleepless devotion that only a woman who has already lost a husband can muster. And Isaac survived. Survived the cold, the illness, the vulnerability of his first months, in a way that might have seemed, to the superstitious minds of 17th century England, almost miraculous. He was baptized on the 1st of January, a New Year's child, given the name of the father he would never know. For 3 years, mother and son lived together at Woolsthorpe Manor in what must have been, despite the circumstances, a cocoon of relative warmth. Hannah managed the farm and the estate. Isaac grew, slowly, into a quiet and watchful child. He was not the kind of boy who ran through fields or roughhoused with other children. He was, from his earliest years, an observer, a collector of impressions. He watched the way light moved through windows. He noticed how shadows changed their shape throughout the day. He was, even as a toddler, intensely interior, as if some part of him was always elsewhere, turning something over in his mind. Then, when Isaac was 3 years old, everything changed. Hannah remarried. Her new husband was the Reverend Barnabas Smith, the rector of the neighboring village of North Witham. Smith was 63 years old to Hannah's 27, a wealthy, respectable, and apparently unimaginative man who had one firm condition upon the marriage. He would not take Hannah's child into his household. Isaac was to remain at Woolsthorpe Manor, to be raised by his maternal grandparents, James and Marjorie Ascough, while his mother went to live a mile away in a life he would not be part of. What this meant to a 3-year-old boy, the abrupt removal of his mother, the installation of grandparents who by all evidence were adequate but not warm, is impossible to know with certainty. Newton was not a man who spoke easily of his inner life. He was not given to the kind of confessional autobiographical writing that might have illuminated those years. But there are clues. In a notebook that survives from his adolescence, Newton made a list of his sins, a practice common among devout young Puritans of the era, an exercise in self-examination, and among the sins he listed were entries that suggest the depth of the wound his mother's departure had left. He wrote of threatening to burn his mother and stepfather's house down. He wrote of hostility toward them. He wrote, in the clipped, factual shorthand of a boy cataloging his own darkness, of emotions that had clearly never fully subsided. Barnabas Smith was not cruel to Isaac precisely. He simply erased him. He left the boy at Woolsthorpe and built a new life with Hannah that produced 3 more children, a half-brother and 2 half-sisters whom Isaac would later know but never feel fully connected to. Smith died in 1653 when Isaac was 10, and Hannah returned to Woolsthorpe, bringing her 3 younger children with her. Isaac was 10 years old when his mother came back. He had been without her for 7 years. Some biographers have suggested that this early abandonment, this cleaving of the most fundamental bond a young child knows, became the hidden engine of Newton's entire life. The loneliness, the self-sufficiency, the almost pathological independence of mind, the difficulty with intimacy, the ferocious need to understand and to control and to master, all of it, they argue, flows from that original wound. It is speculation, of course, as all such psychological archaeology must be. But it is not implausible. The boy who grew up understanding that the person who was supposed to be closest to him could simply disappear one day and leave him with strangers. That boy might reasonably decide that the only thing truly worth trusting was his own mind. The Woolsthorpe of Isaac's childhood was a landscape of stone walls and limestone paths, of fields that turned golden in summer and gray in winter, of nights so dark that the stars seemed close enough to touch. Newton would later say that he had noticed, even as a child, how the heavens moved, how certain lights in the sky stayed in place while others wandered, how the moon grew and diminished on a schedule that seemed orderly, deliberate, as if someone or something was keeping careful count. He did not know then that he would one day explain why the moon moved as it did. He only knew that it moved, and that the movement was beautiful and orderly and suggested, in some way he could not yet articulate, that the world had structure beneath its surface. He also built things. This is one of the consistent details that emerges from the accounts of Newton's childhood. He was a maker. He constructed a working model of a windmill, not just a decorative miniature, but a functioning mechanism with all its parts in correct proportion. He is said to have built a cart that he could sit in and drive by, turning a crank with his hands. He made paper kites of unusual size and flew them at night with lanterns attached, terrifying the local farmers who saw lights moving through the darkness and could not account for them. He built sundials, several of them, positioned at different angles throughout the house and garden so that he could track the sun's movement from waking to sleeping. His family called them Isaac's dials. They were precise enough to be genuinely useful. These were not merely the hobbies of an energetic child. They were the first stirrings of an extraordinary mind that thought in mechanisms, that understood the world as a system of interconnected causes and effects, that found more satisfaction in building something that worked than in the social world of other children. Isaac Newton was not popular at school. He was not beloved by his peers. He was, by most accounts, solitary and strange. A boy who walked around with his head elsewhere, who forgot to eat, who built things in his room by candlelight, who seemed to inhabit a slightly different world than the one his classmates lived in. He attended the free grammar school in Grantham, a market town about 7 miles from Woolsthorpe, boarding during term time with the local apothecary, a man named Clark. The school taught Latin, Greek, the Bible, and basic arithmetic, the standard curriculum of a 17th century grammar school, designed to produce clergymen and administrators rather than natural philosophers. Newton found none of it particularly engaging, at least at first. He ranked near the bottom of his class. He was the kind of student whom teachers notice but cannot quite reach. Clearly intelligent, but resistant, turned inward, not interested in the things that were being taught. Then something happened. A boy who was older and stronger than Newton kicked him in the stomach. It was a casual, thoughtless act of the kind that schoolboys have always committed against weaker ones. The boy's name was lost to history, which seems appropriate given what followed. Newton, who was not by temperament a fighter, who was smaller than his peers and had no particular physical gifts, decided to respond in the only way that really interested him. He decided to beat the boy academically. He would outrank him. He would, through pure intellectual effort, make himself superior. It sounds like the plot of a motivational story, and perhaps it has been tidied up in the retelling over 3 centuries, but the broad outlines are confirmed. Newton, who had been indifferent to his schoolwork, began to apply himself and rose rapidly through the rankings. He went from the bottom of his class to the top. The boy who had kicked him faded into irrelevance. Newton did not stop there. Once he had started climbing, he kept climbing, not because he had anything to prove to anyone else, but because he had discovered, in that act of competition, something about himself, that when he truly applied his mind, there was almost nothing it could not master. His teacher at Grantham was a man named Henry Stokes, who recognized, in Newton's sudden ascent, something more than ordinary diligence. Stokes was not a remarkable man, but he had the instincts of a good teacher. He knew the difference between a student who was working hard and a student whose mind was genuinely exceptional. He wrote to Hannah Newton, urging her to allow her son to continue his education rather than be brought home to manage the farm. Because Hannah, who had returned to Woolsthorpe after her second husband's death, had plans for her eldest son that had nothing to do with universities or natural philosophy. She wanted him to be a farmer. She had a farm that needed managing, an estate that required oversight, 3 younger children who needed feeding. Isaac was the eldest, and in the England of the 1650s, eldest sons managed estates. That was what they did. The story of what happened next has a slightly comedic quality that Newton himself, who had almost no sense of humor, might not have appreciated. He was brought home from Grantham at the age of 17 and set to work managing the farm. He was, by all accounts, catastrophically bad at it. He forgot to mend fences. He allowed the sheep to wander into the neighbors' fields. He let the pigs root up the garden. When he was sent to market with produce or livestock, he would leave a servant to complete the transaction and slip off to read under a hedge. He once sat so absorbed in thought that his horse came home without him. He arrived back at Woolsthorpe hours later, having not noticed that he'd been walking the whole way. His uncle, William Ayscough, who came to visit and found his nephew lying in a field reading a book of mathematics, rather than attending to the livestock, reportedly threw up his hands in exasperation. But Ayscough, like Stokes before him, saw something. He spoke to Hannah. He pointed out what was, in retrospect, rather obvious, that forcing Isaac Newton to be a farmer was a magnificent waste. He urged her to send the boy to Cambridge. Henry Stokes, who had not forgotten his former pupil, agreed. He offered to waive his tuition fees, a significant gesture from a man of modest means, and to house Isaac in Grantham while he prepared for the entrance examinations. Hannah gave in. Perhaps she had always suspected it would come to this. Perhaps she knew, in the way that mothers sometimes know, that her strange, brilliant, infuriating eldest son was not meant for the life she had planned. Or perhaps she simply ran out of arguments. Either way, in the spring of 1661, Isaac Newton, 18 years old, thin, serious, with dark eyes that noticed everything, packed his belongings and left Woolsthorpe. He would return only rarely and never for long. The flat limestone landscape of his childhood, the great dark skies, the windmills and stone walls and the dials he had built to track the passing of the days, all of it would recede behind him as he walked toward Cambridge and the rest of his life. He arrived at Trinity College on the 5th of June, 1661, entered as a subsizar, the lowest rank of student, required to perform menial tasks for fellows and wealthier students in exchange for his keep. He was not wealthy. He was not from a distinguished family. He was a farmer's posthumous son from a village most of his classmates had never heard of. He owned almost nothing. He had no patron, no connections, no one in Cambridge who knew his name. He had a notebook, and a mind of staggering power, and a loneliness so deep and so practiced that by now it had become simply the atmosphere in which he lived. He was 18 years old, and the world had not yet the faintest idea what he was. Cambridge in 1661 was not the gilded institution it would later become in imagination. It was a medieval town of narrow streets and cold stone colleges, of damp rooms and inadequate heating, of lectures that had barely changed since the time of Aristotle. The university's official curriculum was still built almost entirely on the philosophy of the ancient Greeks, above all on Aristotle, whose explanations of the natural world had stood, more or less unchallenged, for nearly 2,000 years. Students were expected to read Aristotle's Physics, his On the Heavens, his treatises on logic and metaphysics, and to learn to argue within that framework. The idea that one might simply go outside and look at the world and draw one's own conclusions from what one observed, the idea that would define the scientific revolution then slowly gathering force across Europe, was not yet part of Cambridge's official curriculum. This presented Newton with an interesting situation. He was required, by the rules of his degree, to learn a system of thought that he almost immediately recognized as inadequate. Aristotle's physics was based on common sense and careful observation, but it was not based on mathematics, and Newton was, from the very beginning of his serious intellectual life, a man who thought in mathematics. Numbers, to Newton, were not just tools for counting things. They were the language in which the universe actually operated, the underlying grammar of reality, beneath all the surfaces and appearances that the senses reported. If Aristotle's physics did not speak this language, then whatever else it was not a complete account of how things worked. He did what the university required of him. He attended the lectures, he read the set texts, he sat the examinations, but he did it in the way that a man does something he considers a tedious formality on the way to something more important. His surviving notebooks from these years reveal a mind that was already operating on two levels simultaneously. On one level, there are the lecture notes, the summaries of Aristotle, the conventional academic work of a conscientious, if not especially distinguished student. On another level, sometimes in the margins, sometimes in separate notebooks he kept under different headings, there is something else entirely, an independent curriculum that Newton had set for himself, drawn from the most advanced thinking then available in natural philosophy and mathematics. He had read, before coming to Cambridge, a book by the English mathematician John Wallis called Arithmetica Infinitorum, a work on infinite series and areas under curves that was then at the cutting edge of mathematical thought. He had taught himself to read the notation, to follow the arguments, to understand what Wallis was doing and where the limitations of his approach lay. He had begun, as undergraduates almost never do, to see not just what the current state of knowledge was, but where the gaps were, where the questions remained unanswered, where the methods were insufficient, where a more powerful tool was needed. He had also encountered the work of René Descartes, the French philosopher and mathematician who had died 11 years before Newton arrived at Cambridge. Descartes had done two things that mattered enormously to Newton. First, he had proposed a new physics, a mechanistic account of the universe in which everything that happened was the result of matter in motion, and in which God had set the whole system in motion at the beginning, but did not interfere in its workings thereafter. This was a direct challenge to the Aristotelian framework, and Newton found it, if not entirely correct, at least far more promising. Second, Descartes had invented a new kind of mathematics, what we now call coordinate geometry, the system of representing geometric shapes and their relationships using algebraic equations. Newton absorbed this too and began pushing it further, asking questions about curves and their properties that Descartes had not thought to ask. His tutor at Trinity was a man named Benjamin Pullen, of whom almost nothing memorable is recorded. Newton did not find him stimulating. He found his own stimulation. He bought books that were not on any reading list. He worked through problems alone, in his room, by candlelight. He was the kind of student who must have been invisible to most of his contemporaries. Neither the witty, sociable presence who charmed the common rooms, nor the brilliant eccentric who made a dramatic impression. He was simply absent, in the way that people who are entirely consumed by their own internal world are absent even when physically present. There was one exception, one relationship from these years that mattered. His name was John Wickens, and he became Newton's roommate in 1663, a pairing that apparently came about because both young men had found their previous roommates impossible to live with and had gone looking, independently, for a quieter alternative. They found each other, and they shared rooms at Trinity for the next 20 years. Wickens later described Newton's habits to his own son. The long hours of work, the meals forgotten, the experiments conducted on the floor of their shared room, the astonishing self-discipline. He seems to have been a decent, tolerant young man who neither shared Newton's interests nor resented them, who understood at some level that he was living alongside something rare, and who chose to accommodate it rather than challenge it. Newton, for his part, seems to have been as close to Wickens as he was capable of being close to anyone at this period of his life, which is to say, not very close at all, but genuinely fond in a distant way. The year that marked the real beginning of Newton's mature intellectual life was 1664. He was 21. He attended, for the first time, a series of lectures given by Isaac Barrow, the Lucasian professor of mathematics at Cambridge, the very chair that Newton would himself one day hold. Barrow was a brilliant man, a mathematician, a classicist, a theologian, a man of such physical courage that he had once reportedly faced down pirates during a voyage to Turkey. He was also, crucially, a man who could recognize a mind greater than his own when he encountered one. He recognized Newton's within weeks of their meeting. What Barrow was lecturing on in 1664 was optics, the behavior of light, the properties of lenses, the geometry of refraction. Newton was transfixed. Not because the content was entirely new to him. He had been reading about light and lenses for some time, but because Barrow's treatment of the subject made clear both how much was understood and how much remained mysterious. There were questions about light that no one had yet answered, and Newton, in the manner that had become characteristic of him, began mentally reorganizing them, arranging them in order of difficulty and in order of the tools that would be needed to solve them. He also, around this time, began to realize that he needed a better mathematics. The problems he was formulating, Problems about motion, about curves, about the way quantities changed continuously over time, required a way of working with continuous change that existing mathematics did not provide. You could calculate the area under a simple curve if you were clever. You could find the slope of a line, but finding the instantaneous rate of change of a quantity that was itself changing, finding, in other words, the exact slope of a curve at a single point, not approximately, but exactly, was beyond what anyone had managed. Newton began to think about this problem the way a craftsman thinks about a new tool he needs, not with excitement exactly, but with a quiet, methodical determination to solve it because it was necessary. By 1665 he had solved it. He had invented what he would call the method of fluxions, what we now call calculus, the mathematics of continuous change. He was 22 years old. He told almost nobody. This is one of the most striking and, in many ways, most characteristic things about Newton, the extraordinary secrecy with which he held his discoveries. The method of fluxions, an intellectual achievement that would have made the reputation of any mathematician in Europe, sat in Newton's notebooks, visited occasionally, extended and refined, but not shared, not published, not discussed. The reasons for this secrecy were complex and would take years to fully understand. But at the simplest level, Newton did not publish because he was not finished. He had solved one problem, but solving it had revealed 3 more, and those 3 had revealed 10 more, and Newton was constitutionally incapable of presenting partial answers. Whatever he offered to the world had to be complete, had to be watertight, had to be irrefutable. The incompleteness of his current understanding, however extraordinary by any normal standard, was unacceptable to him. He also, perhaps, simply did not care about recognition in the way that most people do. He was not indifferent to it. The later Newton, who fought bitter priority disputes over calculus and other discoveries, was demonstrably not indifferent to the question of credit. But he cared about understanding more than he cared about being seen to understand. The notebook was enough. The knowledge was enough. For now. In the summer of 1665, Cambridge closed its gates. The plague had arrived in England, the same epidemic that would kill roughly a quarter of London's population in the hot months of that terrible year. And the university, like most institutions, responded by dispersing. Students and fellows were sent home. Lectures were canceled. The communal life of the college ceased. Newton packed his notebooks and his books and his mathematical instruments and returned to Woolsthorpe. He was 22 years old. He had invented calculus. He had begun thinking seriously about light and color. He had sketched the outlines of a new system of mechanics, built on the work of Galileo and Descartes, but going further than either had gone. He was about to enter 18 months of almost total isolation, alone in the Lincolnshire farmhouse where he had been born, with nothing to distract him from his thoughts. The world was about to find out what a mind like Newton's could do when it had nowhere else to go. The countryside around Woolsthorpe was quiet in the summer of 1665, in the way that places are quiet when fear has emptied them. The roads that normally carried merchants and travelers between the market towns of Lincolnshire were largely deserted. In London, the bells of parish churches rang almost continuously. The dead were collected from doorsteps each morning. Ships sat idle in the Thames, their cargoes unloaded, their crews afraid to go ashore. The world had contracted into households, into rooms, into the small radius that safety, or the illusion of safety, permitted. For Isaac Newton, 22 years old and newly returned to Woolsthorpe Manor, the world had contracted into something even smaller, his own mind. He had a room to work in, a garden to walk in when he needed to think, and 18 months of solitude that would prove to be the most productive period in the history of science. The house itself was modest. Stone walls, low ceilings, flagged floors, a garden that ran down to a small orchard where apple trees stood in rows. His mother was there, managing the farm, raising her 3 younger children from her second marriage. Newton's half-siblings were now in their early teens, Mary, Benjamin, and Hannah. They seemed to have left him largely alone. He ate at the family table, presumably, and spoke when spoken to, and then retreated to his room and his notebooks and the unresolved questions that occupied every corner of his attention. He worked, during those plague years, on 3 distinct and enormous problems simultaneously. This was characteristic of Newton in his prime, not the sequential thinker who completes one problem before moving to the next, but a mind that could hold multiple vast enterprises in parallel, advancing each as inspiration or technique permitted, drawing connections between them, allowing each to inform the others. The 3 problems were light, mathematics, and gravity. By the time he returned to Cambridge, he had made fundamental progress on all 3. The work on light had begun in Cambridge, but it deepened in Woolsthorpe. Newton had purchased a glass prism at the Stourbridge Fair in 1663 or 1664. A common enough object, sold as a toy or curiosity, and had been experimenting with it, in the way that he experimented with everything, systematically, patiently, with the intention not just of observing a phenomenon, but of understanding its cause. The prevailing theory of light at this time, associated with Descartes and others, held that white light was pure and undifferentiated, and that the colors produced when light passed through a prism were modifications of this pure white light, stainings or alterations produced by the glass. Newton was not satisfied with this. He designed an experiment so simple and so decisive that it ought to have settled the question immediately, though in practice it took years for its implications to be accepted. He darkened his room completely, blocking all sources of light except for a single small hole in the shutter. Through this hole came a beam of sunlight, narrow and well-defined. He placed his prism in the beam and allowed the light to fall on the far wall. The familiar spectrum appeared: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, violet, spread in a band of color on the white plaster. So far, nothing remarkable. Anyone with a prism had seen this. What Newton did next was the decisive step. He placed a second prism in the path of one of the separated colors, say the red light, and passed it through. If Descartes was right, if the prism modified light by tainting it with color, then passing the red light through a second prism ought to modify it further, producing some new color or mixture. What Newton found instead was that the red light passed through the second prism unchanged. It was still red. It could not be further divided. It was, in itself, pure. The conclusion was inescapable. White light was not pure and simple but composite, a mixture of all the colors of the spectrum already present within it. The prism did not create color. It separated colors that were already there, bending each component to a slightly different degree, a property Newton would call its degree of refrangibility. The rainbow was not added to light by the atmosphere or the glass. The rainbow was already inside the white light, waiting to be revealed. This was a profound revision of how light was understood. But Newton went further. He repeated the experiment in dozens of variations, carefully ruling out every alternative explanation. He recombined the separated colors by passing them through a second prism, oriented the reverse way, and recovered white light. He showed that shadows were colored at their edges because of the different refrangibility of different colors. He worked out with characteristic mathematical precision the exact angle at which each color was refracted. He built from all of this a systematic theory of color and light that he would eventually set down in his book Optics, published in 1704, nearly 40 years later. But the core of it was here, in this darkened room in Woolsthorpe, in 1665 and 1666. The mathematical work during this period was an extension and consolidation of what he had begun in Cambridge. The method of fluxions, his calculus, was refined, extended, and applied to a growing range of problems. Newton worked out systematic procedures for differentiating and integrating functions, for finding maxima and minima, for working with infinite series. He developed what he called the binomial theorem in its general form, allowing him to expand expressions like 1 plus x caret n for any value of n, not just whole numbers. He solved problems in celestial mechanics using his new methods, finding the precise shape of the orbits of bodies moving under various force laws. He was, in these months, creating the mathematical infrastructure for a new physics. He did not yet have the physics fully worked out, but he had the tools. When the physics was ready, when he could see clearly what form the laws of motion and gravitation took, he would have everything he needed to demonstrate it, to calculate it, to prove it. The gravitational problem was the largest and the deepest, and it was here, in the Woolsthorpe garden, that the apple story enters the record, though not, it must be said, in quite the form that later generations imagined. The image that has come down through history, Newton sitting beneath an apple tree, an apple falling on his head, the whole theory of universal gravitation arriving in a flash of inspiration, is a simplification to the point of distortion. What actually happened was more interesting and more characteristic of how Newton's mind worked. He was thinking, as he often did, about the moon. Specifically, he was thinking about why the moon moves, as it does. Why it follows a curved path around the Earth rather than flying off in a straight line. This was not a new question. Descartes had proposed that the planets were carried around the sun in vast whirlpools of invisible matter, vortices that swept everything along with them. Galileo had shown that objects near the Earth's surface fall with a constant acceleration. Robert Hooke and others had speculated that there might be some attractive force between the Earth and the Moon, analogous to the force that pulled apples downward. But no one had managed to make these intuitions precise, to express them as a mathematical relationship that could be tested against the actual behavior of the heavens. Newton's breakthrough, and it was a breakthrough, though one that had to be completed much later and depended on a mathematical tool he had not yet perfected, was to recognize that the force pulling an apple toward the Earth and the force holding the moon in its orbit might be the same force. Not similar forces of the same general kind, but literally the same force, operating at different distances, diminishing according to a precise mathematical rule. The rule he tested, and he was testing it, not discovering it from scratch, since the inverse square relationship had been guessed at by others, was that the force of gravity decreased with the square of the distance. Double the distance from the Earth's center, and the force is reduced to 1/4. Triple the distance, and the force is reduced to 1/9. The moon is approximately 60 Earth radii from the Earth's center. If the same force that pulls an apple at the surface of the Earth extends to the moon, diminished by the square of the distance, then the moon should be falling toward the Earth. Falling, like any projectile, away from the straight line it would otherwise travel, but falling in a gentle arc that, combined with its sideways motion, produces the circular orbit we observe. Newton did the calculation. He calculated how far the moon should fall in 1 second if the inverse square law applied. He compared this with the actual observed motion of the moon, and he found that his calculation agreed with observation. Not perfectly, not with the precision he would later achieve, but well enough to suggest that he was on the right track. Well enough to suggest that something real was there. An apple did fall in the Woolsthorpe garden. Newton himself mentioned it years later to several people, though not to the most famous people who later claimed he had told them. He was watching an apple fall, and thinking about the force that pulled it, and the question that came to him. Why should this force stop at the surface of the earth? Why should it not extend upward, growing weaker with distance but never quite disappearing? Why should it not reach the moon? The answer, he came to believe, was that it did. That gravity was not a local phenomenon, confined to the neighborhood of the Earth's surface, but a universal one, extending through all of space, holding the moon in its orbit, holding the planets around the sun, binding the cosmos together in a single mathematical web. He could not prove it yet. His calculation was approximate, partly because the best available measurements of the Earth's size were slightly inaccurate. He would need years more work, a more rigorous mathematical framework, and the collaboration of one or two other minds before he could demonstrate it fully. But the essential insight was here. The heavens and the earth obeyed the same laws. The force that brought the apple down was the force that kept the moon aloft. The universe was, at its deepest level, unified. Newton put his notebooks away. He returned to Cambridge when the plague subsided, in the spring of 1667. He was 24 years old. He had, in 18 months of rural isolation, established the basis for what would become the most comprehensive theory of physical reality the world had ever seen. He told almost nobody he had a great deal more work to do. When Newton returned to Cambridge in April 1667, the university was gradually coming back to life. Students filtered back from their dispersed households. Fellows resumed their common room conversations. The bells of the colleges rang again, marking the hours of prayer and study and meals. Cambridge reassembled itself, and Isaac Newton slipped back into it like a stone dropped into still water, making almost no ripple. He was elected a minor fellow of Trinity College in October 1667 and a major fellow in 1668. These were quiet, undramatic events. He was now formally part of the college, entitled to rooms and a stipend. He was no longer a subsizar, no longer required to empty chamber pots or run errands for his betters. He had a degree, and a position, and a future in the academic world if he wanted it. His contemporaries saw a young man of modest background who had done well enough at university and was now beginning a conventional academic career. None of them, or almost none, had any idea what was in his notebooks. Isaac Barrow knew. Barrow had maintained his interest in his extraordinary young colleague since those lectures on optics in 1664, and when, in 1669, he decided to resign his Lucasian professorship to pursue a career in theology, he did something remarkable. He ensured that Newton was appointed his successor. Newton was 26 years old. He became the second Lucasian professor of mathematics at the University of Cambridge, a position created in 1663, carrying with it a salary, the obligation to lecture, and the designation as the university's foremost mathematical mind. The Lucasian professorship required its holder to give one lecture a week during each of the 3 terms. Newton gave his lectures. Students came, at least in the early years, though numbers dwindled as it became clear that the lectures were extremely difficult and that Newton had no particular gift for making complex ideas accessible to ordinary minds. He would arrive, speak carefully and precisely for about 50 minutes on whatever mathematical or optical topic he was developing, and then wait. If no one had questions, and usually no one did, he would leave. He was not unkind to his students. He was simply not interested in meeting them where they were. His mind was elsewhere. What it was elsewhere with, in these years from 1667 to around 1675, was primarily optics. He had been developing his theory of light since the plague years, and now he turned it into a series of polished lectures that were, whatever their students made of them, among the most sophisticated scientific work of the 17th century. He went beyond the prism experiments, investigating the behavior of light in more and more complex situations. Light passing through thin films, through soap bubbles, through the air between two glass surfaces pressed together. He found in all these situations patterns of colored rings and bands that he could measure with great precision. These patterns, now known as Newton's rings, would eventually suggest to physicists centuries later that light had wave-like properties, though Newton himself resisted this interpretation and held throughout his life that light was composed of particles. He also built a telescope. This is worth dwelling on, because it illustrates the way Newton's mind worked, not just as a theorist but as an experimentalist and craftsman. The refracting telescopes of his day, the kind in which light passes through a glass lens, had a persistent problem. Because different colors of light are refracted to different degrees, a simple lens focuses each color at a slightly different point, producing blurry images with colored fringes around bright objects. This chromatic aberration, as it was called, was well known and regarded as an inevitable limitation. Newton's response was characteristic. He decided to build a different kind of telescope, one that used a curved mirror instead of a lens. Mirrors, unlike glass lenses, do not disperse colors differently. All wavelengths of light reflect at the same angle. A reflecting telescope would, in principle, produce sharp, color-free images regardless of its aperture. The idea was not entirely original to Newton. James Gregory had described such a design a few years earlier, but Gregory had not built one because the technical challenges of grinding a small, precisely curved metal mirror were formidable. Newton ground and polished the mirror himself. He made his own alloy, speculum metal, a mixture of copper and tin, melted and cast it, and then ground it to the required parabolic shape by hand, with tools he also made himself. The completed instrument was roughly 6 inches long, and when Newton pointed it at the night sky, the images it produced were incomparably sharper than those of refractors several feet in length. He brought it to a meeting of the newly formed Royal Society in London in 1671, and the reaction was extraordinary. The members of the society, scholars, gentlemen, virtuosi of all descriptions, gathered around this tiny instrument and marveled. Newton was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society almost immediately. He was 30 years old, and the world was beginning, tentatively, to notice him. The Royal Society's interest in the new telescope led, indirectly, to the first public presentation of Newton's theory of light and colors. He submitted a paper to the Society's journal, the Philosophical Transactions, in February 1672, his first published scientific work. It described his prism experiments, his theory that white light was composite, his measurement of the different refrangibilities of different colors. It was a landmark paper, a model of scientific reasoning. a clearly stated hypothesis, an experimental design, a description of the results, and a conclusion that followed inevitably from those results. The reaction from the scientific community was not the uncritical admiration Newton had perhaps expected. There were objections. Robert Hooke, the Society's curator of experiments, a brilliant and prickly man who would become Newton's most persistent antagonist, wrote a critical response suggesting that Newton's experiments could be explained by Hooke's own wave theory of light without Newton's modifications. Other correspondents raised other objections. Newton, who had spent years working through every possible alternative explanation before publishing, and who was absolutely certain of his conclusions, was not interested in compromises or modifications. He replied to the objections with careful, thorough, occasionally impatient rebuttals. He replied to subsequent objections with more rebuttals. The correspondence went on for years, and Newton found it exhausting and infuriating. In 1675, he effectively withdrew from the scientific community. He stopped replying to letters. He stopped attending Royal Society meetings. He buried himself in his rooms at Trinity and pursued a new and, by the standards of his contemporaries, deeply strange set of interests. He had become fascinated by alchemy. This is the aspect of Newton's intellectual life that later generations found most difficult to assimilate. The man who discovered the laws of motion and gravitation, who invented calculus, who worked out the nature of light, this man spent roughly 25 years of his life reading and performing alchemical experiments, filling over 1 million words of manuscript with notes on alchemical procedures, correspondences, and theories. He read every alchemical author he could find. He acquired one of the largest alchemical libraries in England. He performed experiments in a small laboratory he set up in the garden of his Trinity College rooms, tending furnaces and heating mixtures of metals and acids and sulfurs through the night. How do we reconcile this with everything else? Some historians have tried to dismiss the alchemy as a peculiar hobby, unconnected to the serious scientific work. Others have gone too far in the opposite direction, claiming that the alchemy was actually more central to Newton than his mathematics. The most honest answer is probably that they were not as separate as they appear. Alchemy, in the 17th century, was not quite what the word suggests to a modern reader. It was not mere mystical charlatanism, though it contained elements of mysticism. It was an attempt to understand the hidden nature of matter, to discover the principles that governed how substances combined and transformed. Newton's alchemical reading and experimenting was, at some level, continuous with his interest in the forces that held things together: gravity, cohesion, the mysterious attractions and repulsions that govern the behavior of matter at all scales. He was also, during these years, deeply engaged in theology. He was a Christian, but not an Orthodox one. He had read the early church fathers extensively and had reached the conclusion, a dangerous conclusion in 17th century England, where the penalty for denying the Trinity could theoretically be severe, that the doctrine of the Trinity was a 4th century corruption of true Christianity. He believed in God the Father as the supreme being, and in Christ as a divine but subordinate figure not equal to the Father. He spent years compiling evidence for this view, filling thousands of pages with theological arguments, but he kept these convictions almost entirely secret. To have published them would have ended his career, and possibly worse. There is something poignant about this image of Newton in the middle years of his life, the greatest mathematician and natural philosopher in the world, spending his nights in a garden laboratory tending alchemical fires, filling his days with theological speculations he could never share, teaching lectures that few attended, maintaining almost no friendships, writing 1,000,000 words that he would never publish. He was 40 years old, then 45, and the world still had almost no idea what he had done. The calculus was still in notebooks, the theory of gravitation, the insight from the plague years, still incomplete, still unverified to his satisfaction, was still unwritten. He needed a reason to finish it. He would find one, at last, in an unexpected encounter with a man who knew just enough about the problem to ask the right question. The man who unlocked the Principia was Edmund Halley. In August 1684, Halley traveled to Cambridge from London specifically to visit Newton. He was 38 years old, an astronomer of considerable ability and reputation, the man after whom the comet would later be named. And he arrived with a question that had been troubling him and his colleagues at the Royal Society for the better part of 2 years. The question was this: if the planets move around the sun under the influence of a force that decreases with the square of the distance, what shape would their orbits be? The inverse square law had been discussed and speculated about by several people. Hooke had claimed to derive important conclusions from it, and Christopher Wren had offered a prize to anyone who could prove what kind of orbit it implied. But nobody had managed a rigorous proof. The mathematics required was beyond the tools then available, or, more precisely, beyond the tools that anyone else yet knew existed. Halley put the question to Newton. Newton replied immediately the orbit would be an ellipse. Halley asked how he knew. Newton said he had calculated it. Halley asked to see the calculation. Newton searched through his papers and could not find it. The notes from those early plague year investigations had become buried under 2 decades of other work, but he promised to redo it and send it to Halley. The paper Halley received a few months later was 9 pages long. It was titled De Motu Corporum in Gyrum, on the motion of bodies in orbit. It proved, rigorously and completely, not only that an inverse square force implied elliptical orbits, but that Kepler's 3 laws of planetary motion, the relationships between the speed, period, and distance of a planet's orbit that Johannes Kepler had discovered empirically in the early 17th century, all followed necessarily from a single force law. Newton had shown that the observed behavior of the solar system was not a collection of separate empirical facts, but a set of mathematical consequences of a single underlying principle. Halley read it and understood immediately what he was holding. He rushed back to Cambridge. He urged Newton to expand the paper into a full account of the new mechanics. Newton, for reasons that may have included his usual reluctance to share incomplete work, his preoccupation with other things, and the ongoing bitterness from his disputes over the optics papers in the 1670s, had not been planning to publish anything. But Halley was persuasive, enthusiastic, and practical in a way that Newton was not. He saw the significance of what Newton had done. He was also willing to do whatever was necessary to get it into print. Newton agreed to write the book. What he had not told Halley, what he had not told anyone, was quite how much there was to write. The 18 months that followed were, in Newton's own later description, a period of sustained intellectual effort unlike anything else in his life, and Newton's intellectual life had not been short of sustained effort. He worked, by all accounts, with an intensity that frightened even him, rising at dawn, working through the day with minimal breaks for food or social contact, retiring late, lying awake at night turning over problems that had presented themselves during the day. He described the experience of writing the Principia as a kind of intellectual seizure, a possession by the problem that lasted until it was solved. The problem was not simply to write up results he already had. It was to construct a complete and coherent mathematical framework for a new physics, a framework that would replace the Cartesian vortices and the Aristotelian spheres and everything else that had been offered, and that would do so with a mathematical precision that permitted no ambiguity and admitted no exceptions. Newton was not writing a natural philosophy. He was writing a mechanics, a mathematical science of motion and force that would apply equally to a falling apple and to the orbit of Saturn. He began with definitions and axioms. The definitions established what he meant by key terms. Mass, the quantity of matter in a body measured by its density and volume together. Quantity of motion, what we now call momentum, the product of mass and velocity, and force, an action that changes a body's state of rest or uniform motion. The axioms, the three laws of motion, were stated with the simplicity and the permanence of self-evident truths. That a body at rest stays at rest, and a body in uniform motion stays in uniform motion unless acted upon by an external force. That the change of motion of a body is proportional to the force applied to it, and in the same direction as that force. That to every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. These three laws, which schoolchildren still learn, and which remain valid for all bodies moving at speeds far below the speed of light, were not entirely original to Newton. Galileo had stated versions of the first two, others had intuited the third, but Newton was the first to state all three clearly, together, as the axioms of a complete mathematical system, and then to show what followed from them. What followed was everything. From the three laws of motion and the law of universal gravitation, the force between any two bodies is proportional to the product of their masses and inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them. Newton derived the entire mechanics of the solar system. He derived the elliptical orbits of the planets and proved that they followed from his laws exactly. He derived the paths of comets, showing that they moved in highly elongated ellipses or parabolas, not in some different class of orbit as many had believed. He explained the tides, the rise and fall of the sea, which had perplexed observers since antiquity, as the result of the combined gravitational pull of the moon and the sun on the Earth's oceans, and he calculated the relative contributions of each with remarkable accuracy. He calculated the shape of the Earth itself, showing that it must be slightly flattened at the poles and bulging at the equator as a result of its rotation, and he predicted the exact degree of flattening, a prediction that was confirmed observationally decades later. He worked out the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble in the Earth's axis that causes the position of the stars in the sky to shift over a cycle of roughly 26,000 years, and showed that it resulted from the gravitational pull of the sun and moon on the Earth's equatorial bulge. The Principia Mathematica was published in July 1687. Its full title was Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica, the Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy. Edmund Halley had personally supervised its publication, and, when the Royal Society declined to fund it after an expensive previous publication had not sold well, had paid for its printing out of his own pocket. He wrote the preface in the form of a Latin ode praising Newton's genius, which Newton accepted with characteristic graciousness and had inserted without comment. The book was 500 pages long, written in Latin, presented in the style of Euclid's Elements, definitions, axioms, propositions, proofs, and was so difficult that most of its first readers, even the best mathematicians in Europe, could not follow the proofs. Newton had deliberately made it difficult. He was aware that the calculus, with which he had actually done much of the work, would be controversial and would distract from the content, so he had translated his results back into the language of classical geometry, a harder and less transparent approach, but one that rested on universally accepted foundations. The consequence was a book that was simultaneously the most important work of natural science ever published, and one that almost nobody could actually read. It did not matter, the conclusions were understood even by those who could not follow the proofs. The universe moved according to mathematical laws. The laws could be stated precisely and simply. Their consequences could be calculated exactly and compared with observation. The match was perfect. Newton had not just described how things moved, he had explained why. Fame, when it finally came to Newton, came all at once and from several directions simultaneously, and he found it, characteristically, not entirely pleasant. The Principia had made him the most celebrated natural philosopher in Europe. Letters arrived from philosophers and mathematicians in France, Germany, the Netherlands, and beyond. His name was spoken in universities and in the drawing rooms of the educated classes. In England, which had produced no philosopher of comparable stature since Francis Bacon, he was being treated as something between a genius and a saint. Newton responded to this celebrity by having a nervous breakdown. In the years between 1692 and 1694, Newton's letters to his friends and correspondents, particularly to the philosopher John Locke and the mathematician Samuel Pepys, show a man in serious mental distress. He wrote to Locke in September 1693 with a letter so strange that Locke was genuinely alarmed. Newton accused him of trying to embroil him with women, said he was so ill that he had to give up philosophical work, and expressed a general incoherence that was quite unlike his normal, precise correspondence. The letter to Pepys was similar in its disordered quality. Newton later wrote to Locke and Pepys apologizing for what he called a distemper that had affected his sleep and his reason. The cause of this episode has been debated by historians and scientists for generations. Some have suggested mercury poisoning from his alchemical experiments. Analysis of a strand of Newton's hair conducted in the 20th century did reveal extremely high mercury levels. Others have pointed to overwork, isolation, the stress of his position, the strain of years of solitary intellectual effort. Others still have noted that this was the period when Newton's closest relationship, his friendship with a young Swiss mathematician named Nicolas Fatio de Douillet, seems to have come to an abrupt end, for reasons that are not fully clear. Whatever the cause, Newton was unwell for roughly 2 years and produced very little new work during this time. He recovered. By 1694 he was functioning again, though he was never quite the same as he had been before. The blazing creative intensity that had carried him through the work on the Principia had somewhat abated. He was now in his early 50s, and the extraordinary period of his life, from roughly 1664 to 1687, from the plague years through the publication of the Principia, was effectively over. He had, in those 23 years, done more than any other single person in the history of science. He was not done, but the great creative work was behind him. What lay ahead was the battles, and Newton, it turned out, was a formidable enemy. The dispute with Robert Hooke had been simmering since the early 1670s, when Hooke's dismissive response to Newton's optics paper had provoked Newton's first withdrawal from the scientific community. Hooke was a brilliant man, the inventor of the compound microscope, the discoverer of the cell, a theorist of spring elasticity whose law still bears his name, and he had a genuine claim to have anticipated some of Newton's ideas about gravitation. In 1679 and 1680, he and Newton had exchanged letters about orbital mechanics in which Hooke had suggested, albeit without rigorous proof, that an inverse square force might explain planetary motion. When the Principium was published and the world discovered what Newton had accomplished, Hooke made the worst decision of his life. He publicly claimed priority. He said that Newton had stolen the inverse square law from him. Newton, whose capacity for cold, sustained fury was extraordinary, responded by systematically removing every mention of Hooke's name from the Principia that could be removed without falsifying the history. He also announced that he would not publish the third book of the Principia, the book that actually applied the mathematics to the solar system and contained the most spectacular results, unless and until Hooke's claims were withdrawn. This was, effectively, a hostage situation. The Royal Society was terrified. Halley begged and cajoled. Eventually Hooke backed down, or at least stopped pressing the matter publicly, and Newton released the third book. Hooke died in 1703, aged 68. Newton was elected president of the Royal Society the same year. Within months of taking office, he arranged for all of the Society's records to be reviewed and reorganized. The portrait of Hooke that had hung in the Society's meeting rooms, the only surviving likeness of the man, disappeared. No portraits of Hooke are known to exist today. The dispute with Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz was even more bitter and more damaging. Leibniz was the German philosopher and mathematician who had, independently of Newton and using different notation, developed his own version of calculus in the 1670s. He had published it in a compressed and difficult paper in 1684, 3 years before the Principia, and nearly 20 years after Newton had developed his own version in his plague year notebooks. Newton had not published his calculus. This was the root of the whole disaster. Had he published in 1666, or 1667, or 1668, when he first developed the method, there would have been no question of priority. But he had not published, and Leibniz had, and the world, understandably, had credited Leibniz with the invention. Newton, when the issue was raised in the 1690s, responded first with private correspondence and then with increasingly public accusations, eventually engineering a Royal Society investigation that he himself chaired and that predictably found in his favor. The dispute consumed the last decades of both men's lives. Leibniz, who died in 1716, was embittered and isolated, his reputation under attack from a campaign of character assassination directed from London. Newton, who survived him by 11 years, pursued the matter even after his enemy's death, polishing and rewriting his accusations for new audiences. The dispute poisoned relations between English and continental mathematics for decades, with English mathematicians loyal to Newton's notation and methods falling increasingly behind the superior Leibnizian calculus being developed in France and Germany and Switzerland. Newton was right that he had invented calculus first. Leibniz invented it independently, which is one of the most extraordinary coincidences in intellectual history. Two of the most powerful mathematical minds of their age arriving, within a decade of each other, at the same fundamental idea using different approaches and notation. There was no plagiarism, there was no theft. There was a tragic coincidence, and two proud men who lacked the generosity or the confidence to share credit with anyone. But it is worth pausing to notice something about Newton in these disputes that is easy to lose behind the unpleasant details of his conduct. What was driving his ferocity, the erasure of Hooke, the sustained campaign against Leibniz, was not simply vanity or pride, though there was certainly pride. It was the same thing that had driven everything from the beginning. The absolute conviction that he had actually done what he claimed to have done, that the understanding he had achieved was real and was his, and that the alternative, the suggestion that it had been done by someone else first, or stolen, or anticipated, was not just insulting but false, and that falsehood was the one thing he could not tolerate. Newton was wrong about many things, but on the specific questions of who had first derived the inverse square law from a rigorous mathematical framework, and who had first developed the full machinery of the calculus, he was right. He had been there first. He had simply made the catastrophic mistake of not telling anyone. In 1696, Newton left Cambridge. He had been there for 35 years. He left behind his rooms at Trinity College, his small laboratory, the walks he had taken through the college grounds for decades, the life he had built around solitude and study. He was 53 years old. He was going to London to take up a government position, Warden of the Royal Mint. The appointment was arranged by his friend Charles Montague, who had risen to become Chancellor of the Exchequer, and who had long been an admirer of Newton's intellect, if not always of his temperament. The Mint was in a state of serious crisis. England's silver coinage had been badly degraded by decades of clipping. The practice of shaving small amounts of metal from the edges of coins and melting it down for profit, and by straightforward counterfeiting. The coins in circulation were of such variable quality that commerce was being disrupted. The government had decided on a great recoinage. All the old clipped and degraded coins would be called in and replaced with new, machine-made currency with milled edges that made clipping impossible. Newton was to oversee this operation. Most people in Newton's position would have treated the warden's job as a prestigious sinecure, a well-paid title that required occasional presence but no real work. Newton treated it the way he treated everything, as a problem to be solved with maximum effort and thoroughness. He reorganized the Mint's operations, pushed the workers to meet the recoinage targets, and took an active interest in every aspect of the process. He was made Master of the Mint in 1700, the senior position, which brought a salary tied to the volume of coins produced, and he held that role until his death in 1727. But it was his pursuit of counterfeiters that reveals the most unexpected side of this unworldly philosopher. Counterfeiting was a capital offense in England. It was legally classified as high treason, and the penalty was death. Newton threw himself into its prosecution with a zeal that surprised even those who knew him. He personally attended informers and gathered evidence, often visiting taverns and prisons in disguise to interview witnesses. He sent spies into the criminal underworld of London. He corresponded with magistrates across England. He conducted interrogations himself. He studied the techniques of coiners and clippers in the same meticulous way he had studied the properties of light or the orbits of planets. His most notable target was a man named William Challoner, a skilled counterfeiter and confidence man who had not only been producing high-quality false coins, but had had the extraordinary audacity to petition Parliament, while under Newton's investigation, claiming that the Mint's security was poor and offering to advise on how to improve it. Newton was not amused. He gathered evidence against Challoner with patient, methodical ferocity over a period of several years, rebuilding his case each time Challoner managed to get himself released or to undermine a prosecution. In 1699, Challoner was convicted of high treason and hanged at Tyburn. Newton attended to the paperwork with his usual precision. He was also, in these London years, pursuing his scientific interests, though with less of the white-hot intensity of his Cambridge prime. His Optics, the book on light and color that he had been sitting on since the 1670s, was finally published in 1704, the year after Hooke's death and his own election as president of the Royal Society. Hooke had been one of his most persistent critics on the optics, and Newton had apparently been unwilling to publish it while Hooke was alive to respond. The Optics was written in English rather than Latin, which made it accessible to a much wider audience. And unlike the Principia, it was relatively clear. Newton had learned at last to explain himself in something approaching plain language. It was enormously influential, not just for its content but for its style. The way Newton presented his experiments with their clearly stated hypotheses and unambiguous results became a model for experimental science. He published 2 more editions of the Principia in 1713 and 1726, incorporating new material, new observations, and his responses to the various criticisms that had accumulated over the decades. The 1713 edition contained the famous General Scholium, a passage added at the end of the book in which Newton addressed the question that had been pestering philosophers since the Principia first appeared. But what is gravity? He had shown that gravity existed, that it followed a precise mathematical law, that its consequences could be calculated with extraordinary accuracy. But he had said nothing about its nature, its cause, the mechanism by which one body could exert force on another across the vast, empty distances of space. His answer, in the General Scholium, was a statement of magnificent intellectual humility. Hypotheses non fingo. I frame no hypotheses. He would not speculate about the cause of gravity because he had no evidence for any particular cause, and he refused to build his system on speculation. Whatever gravity was, whether it was transmitted through some invisible medium, whether it was a property of space itself, whether it was the direct action of God on matter, he could not say. He knew only that it existed and that it behaved as he had described. The mechanism was beyond his data, and he was too honest to pretend otherwise. This combination, extraordinary precision where precision was possible, absolute restraint where it was not, is one of the things that makes Newton genuinely different from the natural philosophers who came before him. Descartes had been willing to speculate endlessly. Hooke had proposed mechanisms with cheerful abandon. Newton would not. If he could not prove it, he would not say it. This was a new kind of intellectual discipline, and it was part of what made the Principia so hard to argue with. His personal life in London had more social texture than his years at Cambridge, but not much. He moved into a house in Jermyn Street with his niece, Catherine Barton, a beautiful, witty young woman who became one of the ornaments of London society and who managed Newton's household and social obligations with apparent efficiency and charm. There has been speculation since the 18th century about the nature of Catherine's relationship with Charles Montague, now Lord Halifax, who was clearly devoted to her and who left her a substantial legacy at his death. Newton seems to have tolerated this relationship, whatever its precise nature, with equanimity. He was fond of Catherine in his distant way. He was also, in the strange social world of Augustan London, a figure of some fascination. The great philosopher who had explained the universe, seen now at dinners and receptions, quiet and formidable, with his white hair and his still dark eyes. Younger people who met him were often surprised. They had expected a prophet, and they found a well-dressed, elderly civil servant who spoke carefully and listened more than he talked. He was polite. He was sometimes witty, in a dry way. He was absolutely impenetrable. He gave generously to family members, to servants who had served him well, to institutions he approved of. He attended church regularly and maintained his private theological convictions. His anti-Trinitarian beliefs, his manuscript upon manuscript of biblical exegesis, in the same deep secrecy he had always kept them. He was worried, to the end, about what would happen if those manuscripts became public. They were not published in his lifetime, and the full extent of his theological heterodoxy was not widely known until the 20th century, when his papers were finally catalogued and studied. He never married. He formed no romantic attachments, at least none that left any trace in the record. There is a story, possibly apocryphal, that as a young man at Cambridge, he had been engaged to a young woman, a daughter of the apothecary clerk in Grantham, with whom he had lodged during his school days. Nothing came of it. He does not seem to have missed it. The life of the mind, for Newton, was not a substitute for human warmth. It was simply more interesting. He was elected president of the Royal Society in 1703 and was re-elected every year for the rest of his life, 24 consecutive years of presidency, during which he transformed the society from a somewhat gentlemanly club into a more serious institution. He was knighted by Queen Anne in 1705, the first scientist to receive a knighthood specifically for scientific work, becoming Sir Isaac Newton, a title he used with a quiet satisfaction. He had come a long way from Woolsthorpe. In the winter of 1724, Newton began to decline. He was 81 years old, which was an extraordinary age for the time. Most of his contemporaries had died decades earlier. He had been in reasonable health well into his 70s, working at the Mint, attending Royal Society meetings, corresponding with mathematicians and philosophers across Europe. Now his kidneys were failing. He had what his doctors called the stone. Kidney stones, almost certainly, a condition of great pain that in that era had no reliable treatment. He bore it with the stoicism that had characterized everything else in his life. In February 1727, he attended his last meeting of the Royal Society in London. He was helped into his chair. He presided over the meeting. He was, by all accounts, alert and engaged, asking questions and following the discussion with his old precision. He returned to his house at Cranbourne Street, Kensington, to which he had moved some years before, and went to bed. He never fully recovered. He died on the 20th of March, 1727, in his sleep, apparently without pain. He was 84 years old. He died intestate, without a will, which was unusual for a man of his means, and unusual for so meticulous a personality. The absence of a will may have been deliberate, a way of avoiding the explicit distribution of his estate, which included not only his considerable fortune but his papers. Thousands upon thousands of manuscript pages, packed into boxes, covering every subject from the orbits of comets to the identity of the Antichrist. His heirs, and eventually institutions, sorted through them for decades. The Royal Society bought some. John Maynard Keynes bought a large collection at auction in 1936, and on examining the contents, famously declared that Newton was not the first of the Age of Reason, but the last of the magicians. He was buried in Westminster Abbey, in the nave, beneath a monument erected in 1731 that showed him reclining on a bas-relief of cherubs and scientific instruments, with a globe displaying the path of the 1680 comet above him, and an inscription that ended with the words, Sibi gratulentur mortales tale tantumque extitisse humani generis decus. Let mortals congratulate themselves that there has existed such and so great an ornament of the human race. Voltaire, the French philosopher and wit who had visited England and had been deeply impressed by Newton's work, attended the funeral and was astonished to see a scientist buried with the honors of a king. In France, such a thing was impossible. In England, apparently, a man who had explained the motion of the planets could be honored like a head of state. Voltaire wrote about it, helping to spread Newton's fame through the continent and to make him, in the decades after his death, the central figure of what the Enlightenment understood itself to be about. What had Newton actually done? It is worth asking the question directly, because the scale of the achievement can become obscured by familiarity, and because the summary, he discovered the laws of motion and gravity, does not quite capture the strangeness and the magnitude of it. Before Newton, the universe was observed but not understood. The planets moved in the ways Kepler had described, but nobody knew why. Objects fell to Earth, but the relationship between their motion and the motion of the heavens had never been demonstrated. The tides rose and fell, the comets appeared and disappeared, the stars wheeled through the night sky. All of it observable, all of it catalogued and measured with increasing precision, but none of it explained. The world of natural philosophy was full of competing systems and speculative mechanisms, none of which could make precise, testable predictions about what would happen and when. After Newton, the universe was, at least in principle, a mechanism. Everything that moved according to laws that could be written down in a few lines of mathematics. Every force that existed, at least every gravitational force, could be calculated exactly. The positions of the planets 100 years hence, the date of the next solar eclipse, the precise trajectory of a comet on its first visit to the inner solar system, all of it could be worked out, given enough time and care. From Newton's 3 laws and 1 force law, the universe had become not less mysterious, but mathematically tractable. This was an astonishing achievement. It was also, as subsequent centuries would show, not the final word. In the early 20th century, Albert Einstein would show that Newton's laws were an approximation, extremely accurate for everyday speeds and distances, but breaking down at velocities approaching the speed of light and in the vicinity of very strong gravitational fields. Einstein's general relativity superseded Newton's gravity in the same way that Newton's mechanics had superseded Aristotle's, not by showing that Newton was wrong about the phenomena he had explained, but by showing that his explanation was a special case of a more general theory. Newton could not have known this. He did not know the speed of light. He did not know that space and time could be curved. He did not know that at the atomic scale, entirely different rules applied, rules that would require quantum mechanics, a theory that Newton could not even have imagined. He worked with the knowledge of his time, and he pushed that knowledge further and harder and deeper than anyone before him. What he left behind was not just a set of equations, though the equations were extraordinary. He left behind a way of doing science, the insistence on mathematical precision, the distinction between what could be proved from evidence and what could only be speculated, the commitment to making predictions that could be tested and either confirmed or refuted, hypotheses non fingo. He had made it possible to know, not just to wonder. He also left behind, for those who looked closely enough, a portrait of a certain kind of human being, solitary, driven, unable or unwilling to form the easy social bonds that most people take for granted, finding in the act of understanding the world a satisfaction that seemed to require nothing and no one else, whether this was the result of his childhood, the absent father, the abandoning mother, the 7 years in the care of grandparents who were adequate but not warm, or whether it was simply who he was, cannot be known for certain. What can be known is that the mind that emerged from that particular childhood, from that particular combination of wound and will, was the mind that worked out the architecture of the cosmos. He was not, by most human standards, a happy man. He had few friends, no wife or children, a gift for enmity that he exercised with great thoroughness over a long life. He was suspicious, cold, occasionally vindictive, and almost pathologically reluctant to share what he knew. He saw the world in a way that almost nobody around him could follow, and the isolation this produced was both his freedom and his prison. And yet, to have understood what Newton understood, to have looked at the night sky and seen not just beauty and mystery, but the clean lines of a mathematical structure that bound the whole cosmos together, must have been, at some level, a kind of happiness that required no company. The apple fell in the Woolsthorpe garden, and his mind reached upward from that falling, through the miles of air to the moon and beyond, through the silence of space where no wind blew and no sound carried, out to the edge of what could be known. And what he found there was order, the same order, everywhere, all the way down to the last decimal place his calculations could reach. He once wrote, toward the end of his life, that he did not know how he appeared to the world, but to himself he seemed to have been only like a boy playing on the seashore and diverting himself now and then, finding a smoother pebble or a prettier shell than ordinary, whilst the great ocean of truth lay all undiscovered before him. It was, for Isaac Newton, a remarkably humble statement, and also perhaps the truest thing he ever said, that the more he understood, the larger the mystery grew, that the shore he had walked was beautiful, and that the shells he had found were astonishing, and that the ocean stretching out beyond the reach of his vision was vaster than any single mind could compass. He died in the quiet dark of a March morning, in a house in Kensington, with the papers of a lifetime packed in boxes around him, papers full of planets and prisms and alchemical fire and angels and the motions of comets, and the stars continued their ancient courses overhead, moving in the paths he had described, according to the laws he had found, through the long, indifferent night,